El máster interuniversitario en migraciones contemporáneas, de hecho, es una de las ofertas más completas para estudiar y formarse en las migraciones en el Estado español en la actualidad. Nosotros tratamos desde los aspectos legales, jurídicos, mercado de trabajo, políticas sociales, políticas públicas.
Es el resultado de la unión de dos universidades líderes en el tema y en la investigación sobre la inmigración, que son la Universidad de Barcelona y la Universidad Autònoma de Barcelona, a través de grupos de investigación como son el Instituto de Derecho Público y el CER-MIGRACIONS.
Los dos grupos tienen una larga experiencia, son grupos que trabajan desde disciplinas diferentes, la sociología, el derecho, la ciencia política, la antropología, la comunicación, y la finalidad es precisamente ofrecer un producto que sea a su vez interdisciplinar y centrado en la formación muy aplicada, muy práctica de los estudiantes que cursen este máster.
Es cierto que la realidad desborda esta perspectiva individual sobre las cuales nosotros vemos las migraciones, y además esta idea de abordar, ¿no?, a través de distintos módulos el fenómeno migratorio, yo creo que contribuye o es una herramienta a la cual los estudiantes en un futuro en su desarrollo profesional podrán ir mucho más allá de lo que es en principio su formación de origen.
Lo que me parece interesante es que las clases, además de profesores, las imparten también abogados, trabajadores en ONGs o del sector público, y por tanto yo creo que el máster te da la oportunidad de familiarizarte con aspectos del fenómeno migratorio, digamos, más prácticos.
El objetivo del módulo de mercado de trabajo es analizar la relación entre la inmigración y la esfera económica. Es una aproximación dinámica que contempla la diversidad de perfiles y trayectorias de las personas migrantes, y con un fuerte énfasis en las consecuencias para los procesos de integración laboral y social en distintos contextos.
El objetivo del módulo de Políticas Públicas y Gestión de la Diversidad es proporcionar una primera aproximación a las políticas públicas sobre el hecho migratorio, la diversidad cultural y las minorías étnicas en los distintos niveles de gestión, aunque con un fuerte énfasis en el ámbito local y en las políticas sectoriales más destacadas como salud, educación, vivienda, seguridad.
A través del módulo de prácticas, el máster ofrece al estudiante la posibilidad de realizar estancias en una diversidad de entidades vinculadas al ámbito de las migraciones.
Y en concreto, el módulo de migraciones y educación se preocupa por investigar desde una perspectiva comparativa internacional las condiciones de incorporación de los hijos e hijas de las migraciones internacionales en España, desde la perspectiva de la ciudadanía, desde la perspectiva de los derechos y desde la perspectiva de la clave para su integración social, que es el sistema educativo.
Bienvenidas y bienvenidos a la quinta y última sesión de la semana temática de las migraciones ambientales. Mi nombre es Clara Piqueras y soy investigadora del CER-MIGRACIONS, y junto con Janna Dallmann conduciré la jornada de hoy, en la que vamos a reflexionar sobre los escenarios futuros de las dinámicas migratorias y de las crisis ambientales. Si bien se trata, ¿no?, de una propuesta muy ambiciosa, la de la sesión de hoy, es también muy necesaria para pensar el tipo de adaptaciones y transformaciones sociales que deben promoverse para responder adecuadamente a los desafíos de la migración ambiental, así como para abordar las implicaciones de los diferentes escenarios socioambientales para las migraciones internas e internacionales. En este sentido, la temática que se plantea en esta sesión persigue también hacer balance, en cierta medida, de los diferentes temas que hemos ido abordando a lo largo de esta semana. La primera sesión partió de una mirada multilocalizada del fenómeno de la migración ambiental, donde se abordaron diferencias y similitudes entre continentes en relación a la movilidad por causas ambientales. La segunda mesa redonda se enfocó en abordar la interrelación entre el deterioro ambiental y las desigualdades, prestando atención a diferentes categorías sociales como el género, la clase social o la localización geográfica, entre otras, para poner sobre la mesa cómo las diferentes capacidades de movilidad e inmovilidad se presentan de manera desigual para las personas. Durante la tercera sesión contamos con expertas y expertos que prestaron atención al tratamiento jurídico y ético de las migraciones ambientales, y durante la sesión de ayer tuvimos la oportunidad de atender a un intercambio de experiencias y desafíos que enfrentan las organizaciones no gubernamentales y los organismos internacionales al abordar el tema de la migración ambiental. Bien, al igual que el resto de sesiones, la jornada de hoy contará con intervenciones tanto en castellano como en inglés, y del mismo modo las preguntas o reflexiones que se realizan en la parte final pueden ser planteadas también en ambos idiomas. Sin más dilación, paso a presentar al primer ponente de la sesión. Él es Miguel Pajares, es doctor en Antropología Social por la Universidad de Barcelona y es miembro del grupo de investigación sobre exclusión y control social de esta misma universidad. Es el presidente de la Comisión Catalana de Ayuda al Refugiado y ha sido responsable de diferentes organizaciones. Fue uno de los responsables de SOS Racismo entre 1991 y 1996. Dirigió la estructura sindical de los centros de información para trabajadores extranjeros entre el 96 y el año 2000 y fue asesor externo del Comité Económico y Social Europeo entre el 2000 y el 2012. Es autor de varios libros de ensayo, así como de numerosos artículos centrados en temas como la migración, el asilo, los derechos humanos o la lucha contra el racismo. Su publicación más reciente se titula Refugiados climáticos, un gran reto del siglo XXI. Cuando quieras, Miguel, tienes la palabra.
Muy bien, muchas gracias, Clara. Bueno, es la última mesa redonda, es el último día de la semana y es justo felicitar a las personas que han hecho posible esta semana. En el comité organizador hemos estado 8 o 9 personas, incluida la niña de Søren, pero ha habido 3 que han cargado básicamente con el trabajo y yo les quiero felicitar. Søren, que hoy interviene en esta sesión, Tales, que moderó la sesión de ayer, y Clara, que está presentando. Yo creo que estas 3 personas han estado trabajando mucho para que esta semana saliera bien, ha salido bien y hay que felicitarlas. Para mí es un placer compartir esta mesa con Søren, con Clara Vinke y con François Gemenne, personas de las que he leído y que he aprendido cosas, ¿no? Aquí vamos a hablar en esta sesión, en esta última sesión, de futuros escenarios. Yo voy a referirme a 3 cosas. Una, los estudios de las migraciones climáticas. Otra, el tratamiento político que hemos de dar a los migrantes climáticos. Y otra, el marco general de las políticas migratorias. 3 cosas que en parte han ido saliendo en la semana, pero bueno, como decía Clara, esta es una sesión en la que intentamos recoger lo que ha ido saliendo en la semana y plantear unas perspectivas, ¿no? Observad que hablo de migraciones climáticas y aquí hay 2 aspectos a clarificar. Primero, las migraciones climáticas son parte de las migraciones medioambientales. Hay otras migraciones medioambientales, migraciones y desplazamientos internos y migraciones climáticas son parte de los desplazamientos y de las migraciones medioambientales. Y digo que hay otros desplazamientos y migraciones medioambientales que nada tienen que ver con el cambio climático, que son los provocados por la industria, construcción de grandes presas hidráulicas, minería, ganadería industrial, etc. Hay incluso otros que tampoco tienen que ver ni con la industria ni con el cambio climático, que son los provocados por desastres geofísicos, terremotos, erupciones volcánicas, tsunamis. Entonces, los desplazamientos y las migraciones climáticas son aquellas que se producen por los impactos del cambio climático específicamente. Y los impactos del cambio climático, pues ya sabemos, en estas sesiones no hace falta explicarlo mucho, porque además ya se ha hablado, incremento y frecuencia incremento de la frecuencia y de la intensidad de los huracanes, las lluvias torrenciales, las inundaciones o fenómenos de generación lenta como es el incremento de la desertificación, las sequías, la pérdida de productividad de los cultivos. Todo eso provoca desplazamientos y migraciones, y eso sí que los podemos llamar climáticos porque tienen que ver con impactos del cambio climático. Y el segundo aspecto es hasta qué punto podemos hablar de migraciones climáticas si sabemos que todas las migraciones son multicausales. Este es otro tema que ha salido en las sesiones anteriores, y yo quiero decir que sí, en mi opinión, podemos hablar de migraciones climáticas, de desplazamientos y migraciones climáticas, definiéndolas como aquellas en las que los impactos del cambio climático son un aspecto destacado de la migración. No el único, las migraciones siempre son multicausales, pero es un aspecto destacado y en este sentido podemos hablar de migraciones climáticas. Bien, sobre el primer tema que quería abordar, los estudios sobre las migraciones climáticas, hay muchos estudios sobre desplazamientos y migraciones provocados por el cambio climático y dejan bastante claro, los estudios que hay hasta el momento, que estos desplazamientos y migraciones se comportan de una manera muy parecida a los producidos a otras migraciones forzadas, a otros desplazamientos y migraciones forzadas, que son las producidas por los conflictos bélicos. ¿En qué sentido se comportan de manera parecida? Dan lugar a muchos más desplazamientos que migraciones, es decir, la mayor parte de la gente que se mueve, que cambia su lugar de residencia por un impacto climático, no sale de su país. Generalmente se va a las ciudades, a los suburbios de las ciudades de su propio país. Y cuando se produce migración, la mayor parte de la gente que migra, es decir, que cruza una frontera internacional, se va al país vecino o a un país muy cercano. Esto es algo que se da en los movimientos humanos provocados por conflictos bélicos y se está comprobando que se da igual en los movimientos humanos forzados por impactos del cambio climático. Es decir, no se están produciendo migraciones significativas hacia los países del norte global, como tampoco pasa con los refugiados que huyen de los impactos climáticos. Sabéis que solo el 16% de los refugiados están en países del norte global. El otro 84% está en los países vecinos de aquellos países donde se producen los conflictos bélicos. En ese sentido, se comportan igual. Ahora bien, precisamente, si buscamos una perspectiva en el terreno de los estudios que nos toca hacer, que nos faltan por hacer, tendremos que estar muy atentos también a las migraciones de larga distancia que van a irse produciendo. Que ahora, ya digo, no son muy importantes, tampoco las conocemos demasiado, es decir, tampoco conocemos demasiado el componente climático que tienen las migraciones que nos llegan a Europa, por ejemplo. Sabemos que no son muy importantes, pero es necesario estar muy atento a esto, ir viendo cómo evoluciona e ir estudiando este tema. Bueno, el segundo aspecto que quería abordar, el segundo tema, es, como os decía, el tratamiento político que le damos a las migraciones climáticas. Por ahora no se le da ninguno. Por ahora, las migraciones climáticas son consideradas por los gobiernos como migraciones económicas y no le dan ningún tipo de atención diferenciada en ningún sentido. Pero hay algo que tienen en común los migrantes climáticos con las personas que huyen de conflictos bélicos, con los refugiados que huyen de conflictos bélicos. Y es que son víctimas de unas acciones políticas reprobables, de unas acciones políticas de los gobiernos que podríamos incluso considerar ilegales. ¿En qué sentido los migrantes climáticos son víctimas de estas acciones de los gobiernos? En el sentido de que los gobiernos han vulnerado sistemáticamente los tratados que han firmado sobre el cambio climático. Llevamos 30 años haciendo tratados climáticos. Desde la Convención Marco de Naciones Unidas de 1992, después vino el Protocolo de Kioto, el Acuerdo de París. 30 años en los que prácticamente el único objetivo que tienen los tratados climáticos es reducir las emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero, que son las que provocan el cambio climático. Y las emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero no han hecho otra cosa más que crecer. A nivel mundial, y ojo, en Europa han descendido, pero han descendido, todos los estudios dicen que ese descenso tiene mucho que ver con la deslocalización de la producción. Es decir, que si contamos las emisiones de todo lo que consumimos en Europa y se produce en otras partes, las emisiones no habrían descendido. Los gobiernos han incumplido y esto es lo que convierte a los migrantes climáticos en víctimas de esas políticas de esos gobiernos. Y esto es lo que les hace merecedores de protección internacional. El concepto de víctima lo hemos aprendido, François Gemenne nos ilustró mucho en textos de hace años y creo que tenemos que incorporar plenamente que los migrantes climáticos son víctimas de esas políticas. Entonces, si son merecedores de protección internacional, si son víctimas, ¿podemos hablar de refugiados climáticos? En sesiones anteriores, Raúl Campuzano propuso la idea de que se reconozca la figura del refugiado climático. Amalie Tower, de Estados Unidos, también lo plantea así. Como ha dicho Clara, mi último libro se titula Refugiados climáticos, por tanto, yo defiendo el término. ¿Pero en qué sentido? Yo creo que hablar de refugiados climáticos básicamente sirve para poner a los gobiernos frente a la responsabilidad que tienen en las migraciones climáticas. Es decir, es una forma útil para que se identifique a los migrantes climáticos como víctimas de esos gobiernos y se nos acerque a la idea de que son merecedores de protección internacional. A veces hay que usar términos fácilmente entendibles para que una idea prospere. Pero sabemos que desde un punto de vista jurídico tiene poco recorrido la figura del refugiado climático porque ni está reconocida en la Convención de Ginebra ni en ningún sitio. Por tanto, yo creo que con independencia de que hablemos o no de refugiados climáticos, lo que sí hemos de hacer es avanzar en formas de protección internacional para los migrantes climáticos. En sesiones anteriores, por ejemplo, Beatriz Felipe nos habló de esta figura del visado humanitario que se está proponiendo en el Parlamento Europeo, que se propuso, aunque no prosperó, pero ya se dio ese paso de proponerlo. Susana Borràs nos habló de un enfoque más de fijarnos en los tratados de derechos humanos, etcétera, y tratar de sacar de ahí todo lo que se pueda para avanzar en la protección de las personas que migran por impactos climáticos. Bueno, nosotros en España hace un par de semanas que un conjunto de académicos y representantes de distintas entidades, un conjunto muy amplio de representantes de todas las universidades de España o de bastantes, hicimos un manifiesto defendiendo la protección internacional para las personas migrantes climáticas. Es decir, bueno, se trata de avanzar por ahí. Ese avance puede hacerse a escala internacional, haciendo propuestas, por ejemplo, en las convenciones de Naciones Unidas sobre cambio climático, en las COPs anuales. Puede hacerse haciendo propuestas en los marcos migratorios. Un avance, por ejemplo, lo explicó ayer, creo que fue, no me acuerdo su nombre, Juan Carlos, se me ha ido. Como en el Global Compact por una migración segura, ordenada y regular se introdujo, Juan Carlos Méndez, gracias Tales, se introdujo el tema de las migraciones por causas climáticas, es decir, se puede avanzar a escala internacional, se puede avanzar a escala europea, por ejemplo, como esa propuesta que se hizo en el Parlamento Europeo, se puede avanzar a escala de países. Hay algunos países que han hecho alguna cosa en este sentido, como Suecia, Finlandia, Nueva Zelanda, se han hecho algunas cosas, pero de lo que se trata en definitiva es de avanzar en ir creando formas de protección para unas personas que las consideramos víctimas de unas políticas de los gobiernos. Me dice Clara que 3 minutos, sí. De hecho, me queda el tercer aspecto que quería comentaros, el tercer tema que iba a plantear, que es el de mejorar el marco general de las migraciones. Es decir, yo estoy defendiendo que para las personas migrantes climáticas se les reconozca derechos de protección internacional por ser víctimas. Pero está muy claro que si no avanzamos en mejorar los derechos del conjunto de las personas migrantes, sea por los motivos que sean, será muy difícil que avancemos en mejorar los derechos de los migrantes climáticos. De hecho, eso lo estamos viendo también con los refugiados que viven de conflictos. En la medida en que las políticas migratorias son tan restrictivas, que las sociedades tienen un sesgo xenófobo tan alto como, por ejemplo, las sociedades europeas, que los gobiernos, siguiendo ese sesgo xenófobo, militarizan fronteras, rechazan inmigrantes, etc. En la medida en que hacen todo eso sirve también para rechazar a los refugiados que huyen de conflictos bélicos. Al final se los trata igual que al resto de los migrantes y solo los que consiguen llegar a territorio europeo pueden presentar una solicitud de asilo, pero para llegar a territorio europeo tienen las mismas dificultades que el resto de los migrantes. Por tanto, no avanzaremos en protección para las migraciones climáticas si no avanzamos en una protección general para el conjunto de las personas migrantes, sean por el motivo que sean. En las sociedades europeas estamos tratando las migraciones como amenaza, como un peligro para las sociedades, estamos fortificando las fronteras, militarizándolas, gastando ingentes cantidades de dinero en rechazar, en impedir que los inmigrantes y refugiados nos lleguen a nuestras fronteras. Pagamos a países terceros para que hagan una labor de hacer de policía fronteriza para nosotros. Y todo eso, como decía, tiene mucho que ver con el sesgo xenófobo que se ha desarrollado en las sociedades europeas, especialmente desde los años 80, en los que la extrema derecha empezó a divulgar unos discursos que han ido calando y que yo creo que se han convertido en hegemónicos, lamentablemente, en la sociedad, ¿no? Por tanto, y acabo, combatir esto, es decir, conseguir un mejor tratamiento general de las migraciones es imprescindible para mejorar, para hacer cualquier planteamiento de mejora del tratamiento de las migraciones climáticas. Tenemos que avanzar en una mejor gestión internacional de las migraciones, y aquí hay que decir que los pactos internacionales que se han hecho hasta ahora han sido lastimosamente pobres. Como he dicho antes, Juan Carlos Méndez nos habló de los avances que suponían el Global Compact del 2018 sobre la migración segura, ordenada y regular, pero hay que decir, bueno, también dijo él que no eran vinculantes, muchos gobiernos se desentendieron y al final lo importante es que del 2018 al 2021 han pasado casi 3 años y no ha habido una mejora de las políticas migratorias en ninguna parte del mundo. Es decir, tenemos que ir a otro tipo de acuerdos, tenemos que ir a mejorar la gestión internacional de las migraciones y, por último, tenemos que combatir la xenofobia en nuestros países. El combate contra la xenofobia tendría que ser uno de los grandes objetivos europeos, de los gobiernos, de las sociedades, porque este sesgo xenófobo que se ha desarrollado en nuestras sociedades, este rechazo a la inmigración, a una inmigración que no sería ningún problema, que ni siquiera veríamos, porque si no fuera por todas estas políticas de rechazo a la inmigración, por todas estas actitudes de rechazo, esto es imprescindible combatirlo, es imprescindible reducir este nivel de xenofobia que tenemos en nuestras sociedades y para poder avanzar en tanto en la gestión internacional de las migraciones como en el tratamiento de las migraciones climáticas o en la mejora de la acogida de refugiados, sean por el motivo que sea. Gracias, Clara.
Vale, muchas gracias, Miguel. Damos paso a la segunda intervención, que está a cargo de Søren. Søren es doctor en filosofía por la Universidad de Turín, en Italia, y máster en historia de las ideas e historia de la literatura por la Universidad de Aarhus, en Dinamarca. Actualmente es investigador visitante en el Departamento de Sociología de la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona y miembro del grupo de investigación GEDIME y CER-MIGRACIONS en la misma universidad. Su investigación actual se centra en el papel y la función que desempeñan las fronteras en relación con la migración ambiental, y en su trabajo aplica un enfoque teórico e interdisciplinar que combina la filosofía, los estudios de fronteras y los estudios de migración. Un ejemplo de este abordaje se puede encontrar en un capítulo del libro del que él mismo es coeditor y se titula Debating and Defining Borders, Philosophical and Theoretical Perspectives. Paso la palabra a Søren.
Thank you very much. I'm gonna try to share the screen. There it is. Do you see that?
Sí.
All right. Let's see if I can close this. All right. First of all, thank you very much, Clara, and a bit in line with what Miguel has started with. I'd like to thank as well people I've been working with organizing this conference, and Miguel was one of them. Bea as well, Janna, Claudio, David, Sonia, all the part of the organizational committee. And of course, first of all, Clara and Thales, who has honestly made the bulk of the work to make this conference work. Next thing is, as Clara said, I'm a philosopher, and I've come into migration studies through first border studies and then climate change problematics. So that means that my focus will be theoretical and based on borders, as also the title of my talk today says. So basically what I want to propose is a conceptual framework for studying or analyzing climate migration, harnessing border studies and some of the work they have done there theoretically. One thing though is that this harnessing still needs to be developed. It's still a work in progress. There's no border studies on climate change and pretty much nothing on climate migration either. So this is sort of a first taste of a conceptual framework I've done. All right. So if we see if I can change this. Yeah. First of all, it's important to establish the relationship between climate migration or migration and borders, which basically goes through location and territory, with everything that implies in territory, which we will get into. And the way I want to approach this is that using borders as an analytical lens, but also recognizing the defining impact borders has on climate migration and potentially also climate migration will have on borders. So they are interrelated. Moving on, the way I want to sort of organize this or structure it is that it's going to be a bit of a summary of the last 4 days of talks, roundtables. And it seems to me that there are sort of some major challenges facing the study of climate migrations, which to a large degree go beyond the climate migrant himself. We have to think of those climate migration in terms of complexity, multi-causality, and as such a broad context. As has been discussed here, there's sort of 3 dimensions, sort of 2 basic dimensions, which I'll take over from border studies. The 3rd dimension is still to be developed, which is environmental dimension, which I will point out in the end. So there's a geographic dimension, as a social dimension to this to climate migration that overlaps or intersects with border studies. So first of all, having a look at the borders, they align with these problems of complexity, and they can be used as a lens looking at climate migration as borders do the defining role, which is both to be identified in the social dimension and geographic dimension. So this is sort of the different dimensions I want to pass through right quick. And as you see, there's also a cross dimension where the different parts intersect, thus referring to the complexity of the issue. So let's start with the geographic dimension. If you look upon it in terms of borders, border studies consider the geographic dimension of borders to be multiscalar. That means local, national, regional, and global levels or scales, but also highly interscalar. So it's not; they cannot be distinguished and neatly in containers and boxes. And that's sort of a critique of the still dominating, but in border studies, more or less undermined geopolitical imaginary, which is quote refers to basically where the different geopolitical entities are defined in terms of containers, which is basically what Agnew here calls a territorial trap, because it does not take into consideration the interscalar perspectives. If you look to climate migration, this is just a short overview, sort of, to get a feeling of how it can be used. Here we also have the local, national, regional, global levels, and this could be developed more, but there's not really that much time for that. So moving on, we can take the social dimension, which has sort of been the focus of these talks. And in this conceptual framework, I propose using a model developed by O'Brien and Signer in their paper Responding to Climate Change, the 3 spheres of transformation. So that's societal transformations. Their work is socio-economic transformations, and not so much on the sort of the technical and natural mitigation efforts. So here we have the practical. That's basically how we act and how we respond technically. Can also be used in other aspects, but the way I want to use it here is that it's good as a social explanation, but given that it's made on basis of environmental transformations or societal transformations in the face of climate change, it's adaptable directly to the problematic of climate migration. So there's a political sphere and a personal spheres as well. The political sphere is the system structures, institutional levels. and the personal level is beliefs, values, worldviews, and paradigms. And the three of them are intertwined. And if something moves in the personal level, it's likely to move something in other levels and vice versa. And the interesting thing about this is that borders fits into this model as well. So in practical spheres, one could define borders as borders process and regulate the complex circulation of people, capital, and commodities across the globe. In the political sphere, borders are integral parts of political and institutional frameworks. And in personal spheres, borders are pivotal. They're pivotal in the sense that they're really influencing in many different senses on values, identities, and worldviews. Moving on to the practical sphere of climate migration, we immediately see that yesterday Dina UNESCO was talking about the different key objectives of the IOM. One of them fits directly into this, and as we will see, it fits into each of the three spheres. There are three key objectives. And under this, there are different other practical directly related to the social aspects of climate migration. Moving on to the political sphere, in climate migration, once again, we see the IOM is addressing this in terms of proposing and advocating for investment in resiliency. And we have other of the talkers who has been addressing these questions. Piqueras as well talked about investments as a key issue in terms of addressing climate migration. And then climate change as well will perpetrate potentially the largest redistribution to the highest incomes, which means the inequality questions will be exacerbated. Likewise, there's a huge problem in terms of the industry, which basically means that if that doesn't happen, if we do not change the industrial, basically the economic paradigm to a more circular one, and with less growth, it's very likely that climate migration will explode, basically because of the consequences it will have on climate change. And law, here Susana Bordas was talking about different kinds of lacks in the climate response, and here we have one of them. But we also have a response, which is a global compact for migration. So it's not black and white, but it's, as it seems, not necessarily promising what's going on, as Miguel just talked about. We have the politics as well. There's another area of lack, which Boris has pointed out, and Miguel as well today. And then just to sort of another area of this political sphere is different sectors, institutional sectors. The personal sphere is the climate migration. Of climate migration is the third objective, where the objective is to change the perception of migration. And here we have the ethical levels as well, which is also a lacking level in terms of climate migration. We also have the need to stronger cooperation through the social networks. This can actually be in all three spheres, so it's actually cross-dimensional. And then here we also have a question of responsibility, which is of course tied to who is has been burning off the most fossil fuel, and of course also who has a means to mitigate the consequences of this. And we have the problem of xenophobia as well, another question values. Moving on, we move to the cross-dimensional aspects in climate migration. There's a question of research needs, which go through all the climate migration questions, and could be looked upon through the concept of borders, as I was talking about. Same goes for power, gender and race, class, cross-dimensional, basically on all levels. One can identify those issues. There's also another way of speaking of cross-dimensional. We speak about what are sort of to be the measures, the meters, the ethical compasses of approaching climate migration, as we talked about this week. There's also a question of loops and relationships between geographical scales, where we basically have an north-south relation where the responsibility is reverse proportional to the vulnerability. We also have a situation where the colonizers, basically those that have colonized other parts of the world, start migration, and the colonized are forced to migrate, which is, as Sarah Vigil talked about, is something that climate migration reflects as well. And then we have this circular problematic of going into climate change that perpetuates conflicts, which hampers resiliency and makes climate change impact worse. So going to this last dimension is an environmental dimension. Here I propose to use the so-called socio-economic pathways proposed by the IPCC it's actually easier to read this because it can be a bit, but the IPCC will, in the 6th assessment report, which is coming up soon, be using a new method for outlining the socio-economic scenarios for a number of different societal developments pathways. The aim of these is to cover the range of possible directions world society may take over the course of this century. And it's very broad directions. And then after that, evaluating the chances of these socio-economic political directions, what chances or the potential are for meeting the mitigation targets, adaptation targets. There are 5 of these. I only speak of 3 of them. There's a worst case scenario, which is basically a wholesale fragmentation, and which is based on competition between states, research and nationalism. If that takes place, we have the problem, as Miguel already talked about, that it will have devastating consequences for climate migrants, but it would likewise have devastating consequences for climate mitigation adaptation. The interesting thing about this and the next 2 ones is that within border studies, there are conceptual frameworks for analyzing this kind of pathway, which in this case is a closed border paradigm. In the next one is sort of the status quo, where what is being done now is what is going to be what we see next. So there will be something getting better, something getting worse. Most estimates says that it will be difficult, if not impossible, but the chances are definitely better than for meeting the targets, the 2-degree targets or the 1.5-degree targets of the Paris Agreement. And here we have, of course, the current border studies, which more or less lies up again, between a borderless, closed borders dichotomy, which we see in globalization contra localization or nationalism. And then we have a status quo just to sort of evaluate that, which also have been done, but to keep the environmental perspective, this is some headlines from The Guardian over the last few months. Right yesterday, it seems like if we continue as we do right now, the climate tipping points could topple like dominoes, and we're talking about 2 degrees, which is very difficult to reach at the current moment and in the current way policies are implemented. In fact, we are already at 1.3 degrees above the pre-industrial targets of pre-industrial temperatures. Then we also have the wealthy nations. The failure of responsibility sort of echoes the question of responsibility in climate migration. We have a lack in political will to phase out fossil fuels, and Greta Thunberg is sort of explaining this in clear terms that we're speeding in the wrong direction. Finally, this best case scenario, which is perhaps where many of the questions we have are directed, but are still open. What this would demand is a different kind of international or cross-border in all scales, and most likely in all social status, social nuances. There will have to be alignments and cooperation in a scale that we have not been witnesses to here. And of course, in this context, borders play a key role, either as obstructors or facilitators. So for a border scholar, this is very interesting. And I think that climate migration could sort of be the canary in the mine, how we are able to respond to climate change as such. So this sort of wraps up the whole thing with some of the questions made, which I think are very worthwhile to take up at this point. Alejandra Mancilla was asking us, one cannot start with status quo. One has to question the adequacy of the current structures over against the values and goals to be achieved. But Raúl Campuzano agitated for the need of new imaginaries. Imaginaries, not sort of just something fantasizing, but basically the basic structures by which we conceive the world. You say on the ontological level. Here we have imagination basically doesn't seem to be able to keep up with the reality of transformations, which is a dire warning also to how we are to work with the climate migration. If things are getting really bad, it's not likely, as Campuzano says, that the nation state will be able to, or the framework, the territorial framework determined by nation states still will be able to respond adequately, as we already see signs of. So what are the new categories? I hope this conceptual framework will be helping on that. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Søren. Damos paso a la tercera intervención, que está a cargo de Kira Vinke, quien es doctora en Ciencias Políticas por la Universidad Humboldt de Berlín, con una tesis precisamente enfocada en el estudio del cambio climático y las migraciones. Kira Vinke es investigadora en el Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, donde dirige el proyecto EPIC. Se trata de una investigación interdisciplinar enfocada en África del Este, Perú y la India, que se propone avanzar en la coproducción de conocimiento acerca del clima regional y los sistemas hidrológicos y sus interacciones con los medios de vida agrícolas, la migración humana y la seguridad. Kira Vinke es también copresidenta del Consejo Asesor del Gobierno alemán para la prevención de crisis civiles y la promoción de la paz. En 2014 fue consultora de la cooperación alemana para el desarrollo sobre el nexo entre cambio climático y la migración a ciudades vulnerables en el sur de Bangladesh. Entre el 2016 y el 2017 trabajó como consultora externa para el Banco Asiático de Desarrollo, concretamente en la elaboración del informe titulado Una región en riesgo, las dimensiones humanas del cambio climático en Asia y el Pacífico. Es autora además de numerosos artículos, informes, capítulos de libros y artículos de opinión enfocados en la movilidad migratoria y el cambio climático. Kira, tienes la palabra cuando quieras.
Gracias, Clara. ¿Puedes ver mi presentación? ¿Funciona? Okay.
Sí, se ve perfectamente.
Okay, gracias por la introducción. I will speak in English today. I prepared my presentation in English. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak. It's a real pleasure to be part of this important week on environmental and climate migration. To start off, I wanted to show you a little bit of the work we have been doing over the past years with regards to future scenarios of climate change and migration. How will the impacts on the natural environment manifest themselves in the social system, in the migration system. And some of our work was published in this report on Asia and the Pacific, which we did for the Asian Development Bank a few years ago, and which had a chapter on climate impacts and possible migration pathways in different Asian Pacific regions. As you can see here, there's a variety of climate impacts that can affect migration flows. It has been mentioned in the previous talks that, of course, migration, as many other human actions, is multi-causal, but nevertheless, climate impacts are emerging as important drivers of migration. And you can see here, basically a scientific cartoon of what these drivers, environmental drivers, constitute, from crop yield decreases to storm floods to sea level rise to other drivers. Maybe just look at one of these images more closely. This is Bangladesh in the Bay of Bengal, a country that is situated in a delta, very low-lying area, heavily affected by tropical cyclones, which hit this coastal part that you can see in the picture. Also made worse by sea level rise because the storms are causing flooding events, storm surges, which are reaching further and further inland and are driving people to migrate from the rural areas to the nearest by cities. And we see that these are typically subsistence farmers who are migrating then into the next urban center, where they basically find themselves often in urban slums. So they're migrating into a kind of poverty spiral in this case. Of course, there's also incidences of migration that lead to more positive outcomes. However, if people whose livelihoods are closely intertwined with the natural environment, such as fishermen, subsistence farmers, who don't maybe not have access to very good education or don't have any access to education, it is very, very difficult for them to really be able to place themselves in the urban labor market successfully. So therefore, we did a variety of studies on what we consider effectiveness of migration, in the sense that it can be an adaptation strategy, but it can also lead to maladaptation, or just as a measure of survival. So basically the baseline is here that if we talk about effective adaptation, you would consider that migration should lead to a kind of stabilization, at least, or continuation of the living standard of the migrant that was the case before the climate impact occurred. So we take here as a standard, for example, if you think about other adaptation options, such as fortifying dikes, fortifying infrastructure, you enable people to continue to live their lives as such. If you talk about migration as adaptation, of course, you're implying a huge shift in their life. You're expecting them to move their assets, move their family, maybe take on a new type of employment, eventually also a new type of identity. So it has a lot of implications, sometimes also culturally, if they have to migrate over longer distances, sometimes also language-wise, definitely with regard to the composition of the social structure that they find themselves in. So what we're seeing is basically that proactive migration can be effective. So people who are able to plan their departure, who are able to take steps to be able to afterwards integrate themselves into labor markets, whereas reactive migration is often ineffective in the sense that people may be able to save their lives through migration, but they may not be able to continue their livelihood, continue the living standard that they had before climate impacts occurred. As we move a little bit into the future, what you can see here is a paper by Mora et al., which was published in Nature Climate Change a few years ago, that highlights some of the major risks that we are confronting when we talk about climate change impacts in the future. what you see here is a variety of scenarios, one being the RCP 2.6 scenario, the Paris consensus scenario on the bottom panel on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you can see the kind of business as usual scenario, a high emissions pathway. And these lead to very, very different outcomes. And what Mora et al. Did is that they looked at thermoregulatory limits of habitability, basically, because they looked at deadly heat thresholds. So they're considering the so-called wet bulb temperature, which is the index of both higher temperatures and also humidity. And they calculated in which regions of the world this threshold, after which your body is no longer able to regulate its heat, its body temperature through sweating, because it is too hot and wet. So this means that in the business as usual scenario, you would see around the tropical belt here on the right hand bottom corner, you would see that almost year round, so 300, 350 days per year, this type of heat, extreme heat, would be reached. So this means that such areas, if we go down this high emissions pathway, would practically become uninhabitable, because it's unimaginable that people could continue to live in these areas. If you think about technological system of air conditioning and such, the risks would be really high that if this fails, people will just basically die because of the extreme heat stress. Whereas in a Paris consensus scenario, this could be largely avoided. However, of course, migration also takes place before places become entirely uninhabitable, right? So people will start to migrate before they, in anticipation of changes, and also before risks become extremely high. And just to give you one more example, regional example, we've been researching a lot in Burkina Faso. And what you can see here on the left-hand side is Burkina Faso, on the right-hand side is Chad. You can see here that the number of extremely hot days is increasing. So even by 2030, we will see an increase, a slight increase of extremely hot days. So days where the temperature rises above 35 degrees Celsius. And in some parts of the country, you will see a huge increase in this higher emissions scenario here. And also in Chad, in some areas of the country, the number of very hot days will increase tremendously. And this is significant because these are countries where agriculture is already quite difficult to do because of the arid and hot temperatures. And subsistence farmers are already having trouble to have sufficient harvests for their families, etc. And this has in the past also contributed to conflicts between farmers and herders, so nomadic pastoralists and sedentary farmers in Burkina Faso, because there is population growth, because there is scarce resources, and because the weather is becoming more and more unpredictable. And this means that both farmers are having trouble to adapt, as well as nomadic pastoralists. And pastoralists have to reduce the size of their herds. And this means not only consequences for their economic livelihood, but also consequences for their identity as traditional pastoralists. Another example of a report that is also available in Spanish, and I will drop the link later on in the chat here, is Peru, which is also strongly affected by a variety of climate impacts. And we can see here that there's a few events which are almost unpredictable in terms of their migration outcomes. One is this extreme heat, which I mentioned earlier, which also affects Peru significantly, especially in the Amazon basin. One is the deglaciation. So in the Andes, glaciers are, first of all, melting, meaning that more water is available for a short time until the peak is reached. And then in the summer months, the multi-year ice is gone, meaning that there will be less fresh water available through those sources. And also the effects of El Nino events, some which may become more extreme because of rising temperatures overall. So this means that in order to prevent forced migration because of this type of events, it's really important to of course, reduce global emissions, but also to enhance adaptation planning. So to especially try to direct adaptation planning at the most vulnerable, meaning subsistence farmers, but also communities living very remotely, such as in the Andes, and to provide alternative livelihood options to them. Another study which we conducted last year, over the last 2 years, was the Homeland Study, which looked at another extreme case of climate change impacts, which are small island states and archipelagic countries. And here we paid particular attention to Pacific island states, such as Kiribati, such as Fiji, Vanuatu, but also in the Caribbean, St. Lucia, Antigua and Barbuda, and also in the Philippines. And we wanted to investigate there what options do we really have to address climate change and migration through the existing policies, political institutions that exist there. Are they well prepared? Do they have enough capacity to address these rising challenges? And what we saw is basically that even after the climate impacts that we hear about, like extreme tropical cyclones, like Hurricane Irma, for example, that affected the Caribbean 2017, even after those events have left our global attention, they're out of the media, hardly anybody pays attention to this anymore. They still affect the population there, and some, especially smaller countries, are set back in their development, maybe for years or even decades. So the photos which you see here is of an island which I visited 2 years after the cyclone Irma hit. It's the island of Barbuda, which was completely evacuated. But you can see here, it basically looks like the destruction just happened, right? So 2 years after the event, there was still a lot of damage on the buildings. There was still problems with electricity, problems with flowing water, fresh water access, etc. And this young man who you see in the picture here shows me where his house used to be. So basically his whole future was destroyed by the cyclone. And even though aid flows in, it is sometimes difficult to reach the population. And also it is often not enough to offset the damages, basically. And so we looked at different points of the migration cycle and different moments of intervention. Here HMCC stands for human mobility in the context of climate change. So there are 3 main areas, which is of course to reduce climate risks, mainly also through mitigation, adaptation, reduce vulnerability of the society, so more classical development work, and also to improve the management of human mobility in the context of climate change. Meaning also you need better data because as others have pointed out, it's a field where data is scarce and reliable data is very problematic often. Looking into the future, there's a number of publications estimating future migration flows. One is this study done by the World Bank, which calculates 3 scenarios for these 3 regions, so Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South Asia. And they estimate that in a pessimistic scenario, there will be up to 140 million who are internally displaced because of climate change. And in a more climate-friendly greenhouse gas mitigation scenario would still be significant displacement related to climate change, 40–50 million by 2050. We published recently a short fact sheet with UNHCR to talk about what this means in the context of the current crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we basically realized is that the risk landscape has changed. So we are already witnessing more extreme events and more diverse climate impacts. And this means that all other crises, so health crises, economic crises, are going to happen in the with the background of a changing climate. And this brings us significant management challenges. So, for example, we saw that last year in Vanuatu, people were confronted with the strong tropical cyclones, and at the same time had to manage the COVID-19 pandemic and uphold infection prevention mechanisms and such. So especially for developing countries, but also for developed countries, this poses significant crisis management challenges. However, there's also some positive momentum on the political landscape, which is that there may be a new momentum for the protection of climate migrants. One is this strategic framework for climate action, which UNHCR has just recently published. I think this is a real milestone in terms of acknowledging climate change as a driver of movements, and also in making first steps to address the protection gap. And then also this executive order has been issued pretty soon after inauguration. So the White House ordered this executive order on rebuilding and enhancing programs to resettle refugees and planning for the impact of climate change on migration. And of course, politically in the US, this is a shift in course. After the Trump administration largely denied climate change, now we're seeing that maybe this multilateral force of the US is hopefully re-emerging. Yes, this has been discussed in another roundtable, but just to emphasize it once more, there is insufficient legal protection. The Geneva Refugee Convention doesn't apply to climate migrants. I mean, for once, they are mostly internal migrants, but for the other reason, if they move across boundaries, they don't fall under this convention because they are not persecuted in any form, meaning that they don't fulfill the criteria to fall under to be protected by the Geneva Refugee Convention. And there are these guiding principles on internal displacement, but they're non-binding and they're often insufficiently implemented. And this is the reason why through the German Advisory Council and also through a paper that we're currently having under review, we are calling for a kind of climate passport, a Nansen passport for a climate displaced person. It is in commemoration of Fridtjof Nansen, who fought for the protection of displaced persons in the aftermath of the First World War, and was therefore endowed with the Nobel Peace Prize. He was a polar explorer, but he was also a great humanitarian, and was the father of these so-called Nansen passports. And we are suggesting that in order to protect those who are faced with uninhabitability because of climate change, they should be endowed a passport, a document that allows them to reside legally and work in other countries in order to be able to regain some autonomy over their migration decisions also, because as we all know, migration, especially international migration, is governed by a very strong and strict set of rules. Yeah, just to link to what François will maybe elaborate a bit more upon, I just wanted to make a small shout out to this. We just started recently the Habitable project, a project that aims to develop a predictive understanding of migration trends under climate change, and that will, besides doing the hard science, will also develop some adaptation options and some policy advice to manage migration in the context of climate change, and also have a strong focus on gender and social equality issues. So please watch out for what is coming out of this project. It's a very promising consortium, and yeah, we are looking forward to continue our collaboration with you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Kira. Bien, pasamos ya a la última intervención, que donde contamos con el privilegio de tener con nosotros a François Gemenne. Él es doctor en Ciencias Políticas por la Sciences Po de París y por la Universidad de Lieja en Bélgica y especialista en geopolítica ambiental y dinámica migratoria. Es investigador asociado senior del Fondo Nacional de Investigaciones Científicas en la Universidad de Lieja, donde es director del Hugo Observatory. Es también codirector del Observatorio de Defensa y Clima del Ministerio de Defensa francés y además imparte conferencias sobre políticas medioambientales y migratorias en diversas universidades. Entre ellas en Sciences Po París y Grenoble y en la Universidad Libre de Bruselas, donde ocupa la cátedra Weinheim de Paz y Ciudadanía. Su investigación se ocupa principalmente de la gobernanza ambiental y migratoria y al respecto cuenta con un amplio listado de publicaciones. Ha trabajado en particular con poblaciones desplazadas por causas ambientales, incluidos desastres naturales y las políticas de adaptación al cambio climático. Ha realizado estudios de campo en diferentes territorios, en los que cabe destacar Nueva Orleans después del huracán Katrina o Japón tras el desastre de Fukushima. Forma parte del grupo intergubernamental de expertos sobre el cambio climático y ha participado en una gran cantidad de proyectos de investigación internacionales sobre el tema. También coordinó el proyecto de BAST, uno de los primeros estudios internacionales en examinar las consecuencias sociales y políticas del desastre de Fukushima. Ha sido consultor de varias organizaciones, entre ellas la Organización Internacional para las Migraciones, el Banco Asiático de Desarrollo, el Banco Mundial o el Observatorio de Migraciones de África, el Caribe y el Pacífico, por citar algunas. Cuando quieras, François, tienes la palabra.
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot for the opportunity to speak in this roundtable and in this Environmental Migration Week. My talk will be more political, and I will try to assess some of the key uncertainties that are related to our drafting of scenarios when we look at the interactions between climate change and migration in the future. The first thing that I should say is that it is extremely difficult to make scenarios when it comes to the human impacts of climate change. And there is often a trend to imagine that the human impacts of climate change will be directly proportional to the impacts of climate change. So we've seen many studies and many reports, which I would call environmental determinism, that relate directly the magnitude of the impacts of climate change to the magnitude of the human impacts of climate change. And this is how we've seen projections of millions of people who would be displaced as a result of climate change, dozens of wars that would be caused by climate change. I think we need to be extremely cautious about such projections for two reasons. The first reason is that many of the human impacts of climate change are related to decisions that we might perceive as Westerners as irrational. A lot, if we speak of migration, for example, we note in empirical studies that the migration decision is often taken on the basis of the perceptions of the impacts of climate change rather than on the basis of the observed climate change. For example, in different studies we conducted in Africa, we noticed that people were under the impression that it was raining less than usual, whereas precipitation records showed that it was, on the contrary, raining more than usual. It is really important to keep in mind that people make their migration decision on the basis of what they perceive. And this is not specific to what we call environmental migration. There are many other fields of migration where the migration decision is taken on the basis of what people perceive on their future expectations. For example, every year, there are thousands of young French people who leave France to go to Britain because they think that they will get a better salary and a better job in Britain. And yet, if you look at the macroeconomic figures, the economic situation right now is better in France than it is in Britain. But each of these migrants individually is convinced that his or her future will be better in Britain. And that's a decision we might perceive as irrational, but yet it is rational for them. For them, it has a rationality. So I think that one of the key challenges for research and policy here is first to break away from environmental determinism and consider that the migration decision is really taken on the basis of the perceptions. And that therefore the policy responses need to account for these perceptions as well. In most cases, the adaptation policies are based on the projections that are made by climate models, but they are not based on the way people will perceive these impacts of climate change. This is one of the key dimensions of the Habitable project that we're coordinating and that Kira mentioned just moments ago. In this project, we will also try to assess how people perceive the environmental changes that affect them and how they make the decision to move or to stay, and the way that they anticipate their migration to take place. That is the first difficulty, the irrational aspect, and the fact that the decision is often based on perceptions. The second aspect is that a lot of future migration under climate change will depend on our policy responses. Are we going to encourage migration, or are we going to try and avoid migration? Is migration something that will be facilitated by future policies, funded and encouraged? Or is it something that will be discouraged? Our policy options, and I'm not even talking about the policy options to reduce greenhouse gas and to develop adaptation strategies, our policy options, including policy options for migration, will determine to a high level what future migration scenarios we will have, and whether people will be able to migrate voluntarily or whether people will be displaced forcibly. And I think that this is something extremely important to keep in mind. And in that regard, I have to say that I'm a little bit concerned that very often in public and policy debates, migration are used as a kind of props to alert about the dangers of climate change. Very often you'll have climate activists saying that we should reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, because if we don't do so, then we will end up with millions of refugees knocking on the door of Europe. And of course, the reason why they're doing this is to try and convince industrialized countries that it is in their best interest to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. But doing so, they're also fueling the prejudices against migrants and refugees. And the reaction of industrialized countries might just be to strengthen their border and to tighten their migration policies rather than reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that we should be extremely cautious about such a rhetoric, which is, when you think about it, not very far from an extreme right rhetoric. Furthermore, when we use these alarmist numbers in projections, we hint at the fact that, after all, migration related to climate change would be a future danger, a future risk that we could still avoid by reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And here again, I think that we need to realize that this is a current reality that demands current policy responses, and that if we frame it as a future risk and as a discrete, separate migration category, then there is a real risk that the needs of people displaced by the impacts of climate change right now will remain unaddressed. Final point that I wanted to make, we also need to keep in mind when we do prospective scenarios that one of the impacts of climate change on societies will be to reduce mobility, will be to reduce the possibilities of people to migrate. We know that migration is very often an investment, that migration requires a lot of resources. And the problem is that for those people whose livelihood is clearly dependent upon environmental resources, one of the effects of climate change will be to shrink these livelihoods, meaning that a lot of people will no longer have the resources to migrate, will no longer have the resources to put themselves out of harm's way if a disaster strikes, and therefore we might also have an increase, not just of people on the move, but also of people who are completely unable to move, unable to relocate away from harm. And I think that in future scenarios, this is something very important that we will need to keep in mind. So these are the points that I wanted to make. Thanks for welcoming me.
Thank you very much for all of these very interesting presentations and for sharing part of your work with us. Even though we are a bit over time, we are still willing to give the space for a little bit of debate and have some questions that arrived via different ways, and which I would like to pose to you, our speakers today. So I'm going to just order the questions quickly, and then each of you could respond to it in 4 or 5 minutes, if that seems okay for you. I'm going to present these questions in chronological, in the chronological order that we had to prepare the presentations ordered. So, Miguel, para ti una pregunta, que nos comentaste que falta realizar mucho trabajo por hacer en el ámbito de la concientización sobre la existencia de la movilidad urbana y este vínculo directo que tienen con el cambio climático y sus manifestaciones. ¿Nos puedes comentar un poco más sobre ese manifiesto que mencionas? ¿Hay quizás iniciativas similares desde las universidades? También comentar que nos comentó Iván Rodríguez vía YouTube, que está muy de acuerdo que la xenofobia es un aspecto muy relevante, y dice que esto es el caso tanto a nivel político, pero particularmente a nivel de la interacción social, por ejemplo, de comunidades que reciben trabajadores migrantes temporales. Søren, para ti, actually, this is kind of a question that I specifically have, and I allow myself to ask this in this little space. During the last days, we talked about many different aspects and different approaches on human mobility and the connection to environmental factors. So we talked about geographies of displacement, about national and international policies, often in terms of governance and policy, and the role of international organizations, economic aspects, and so forth. And we very briefly and shortly touched upon philosophical or conceptual issues in depth, let's say. So my question would be how, where do you see the role of philosophy as an area of investigation for this topic? And are there maybe potentialities that could be used more in these ongoing debates? I go on with a question for Kira, which we received. You mentioned a perspective which understands migration as system. Could you elaborate more about this? And is this, and is this perspective, or in how far is this perspective important for thinking about legal protection? And lastly, François, you elaborated that policies have to consider the perceptions of climate change by those who migrate, if I understood right. Could you give some concrete examples for policies that take this into consideration?
Thank you. I'm happy to speak first, if you don't mind, because I will need to board for my next flight. Yes, as I said, the problem is that adaptation policies very often do not take into account the way that people perceive the impacts of climate change. So these policies are designed on the basis of the climate projections, but do not take into account the perceptions of these impacts. And therefore, there is a risk indeed that if these perceptions are not taken into account, then these policies might be counterproductive. So in the field of migration, for example, if the goal is, for example, to discourage migration, for example, by developing other livelihood opportunities in the region of origin, if these policies do not account for the fact that the change in the livelihoods might be perceived differently by different people, there is a risk that such policies might, on the contrary, encourage migration. And I think that's the reason it is extremely difficult, of course, to give you an example of policies taking into account these perceptions, because these policies do not exist for the moment. The only policies that exist are policies that are based on the projections from the models, but not on the perceptions. On this note, I'm going to have to board my flight. So thanks a lot for welcoming me, and I wish you a very good afternoon and a good weekend to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, François. Quizás podríamos seguir con Miguel.
Vale, gracias, Janna. Sobre el manifiesto, Beatriz, Felipe ha compartido en el chat, lo podéis encontrar todos en el chat, la web en la que está alojado, que es la web de migraciones climáticas. Y bueno, ahí podéis leerlo y tal. Es una iniciativa que tuvimos para empezar a mover el debate político. Por cierto, hoy hemos recibido respuesta de la presidenta del Parlamento, Meritxell Batet, del Parlamento español, diciendo que lo han recibido, que les ha interesado, que lo tendrán en consideración y que intentarán promover el debate. Bueno, es muy genérico, pero bueno, hemos tenido esa primera respuesta de la presidenta del Parlamento sobre el manifiesto, que no he tenido tiempo de compartir con el resto de firmantes, pero que luego lo voy a hacer y se lo voy a enviar. Sobre la xenofobia que menciona, que ha preguntado, ahora no recuerdo quién era, sobre, bueno, que también afecta a los trabajadores temporeros, etcétera. Es evidente, es así. La xenofobia afecta a todas las personas extranjeras o no extranjeras, pero con fenotipos que puedan parecer a los más inclinados a la xenofobia, que puedan parecerles extranjeros, etc. Realmente la xenofobia tiene mucho que ver con esas políticas de rechazo a la inmigración, a todas las migraciones, y como hemos visto, y lo expliqué antes, afecta a todas las personas que se mueven. La xenofobia, el rechazo contra los inmigrantes está siendo también un rechazo contra los refugiados. Los refugiados que huyen de conflictos bélicos tienen derecho a presentar una solicitud de asilo en cualquier país europeo, pero tenemos unas políticas de rechazo a la inmigración que también rechazan a los inmigrantes, tampoco les dejan llegar. Y por tanto, aunque establezcamos avances de protección internacional para los migrantes climáticos, esta xenofobia, este rechazo general a la inmigración que se vive en las sociedades europeas, tampoco nos dejará avanzar mucho en ese terreno de protección para los migrantes climáticos. Entonces, por eso yo decía que combatir la xenofobia casi tiene que ser el objetivo central de las organizaciones, de los gobiernos, de todos los que pensamos en cómo se ha de gestionar mejor las migraciones, cómo se las ha de tratar mejor. Tenemos que tener un objetivo central, y es aislar por completo las opciones xenófobas, las opciones de la extrema derecha. Y bueno, yo por eso le daba una importancia central al tema.
Perfecto, muchas gracias. Søren, tienes la palabra.
Thank you. Well, philosophy. Well, I think philosophy sort of, I mean, as a philosopher, I'd sort of say that it's applicable in a lot of places, both in the sense of the different sciences, but also in itself as a science. And I'd like to sort of explain a couple of lines of that. I think philosophy as let's say, for example, that I tried here is basically the science of conceptualization. So climate migration is confronted with some new challenges that are not unheard of. Some of them, others are, but maybe the context and the environmental, the climate aspects come in, and has to be rethought how to conceptualize that and put a basis, or establish a basis, analytical basis for investigating these things. There's also the thing that Gemenne was talking about perception. Here we touched upon probably a very broad aspect, but it could be compared to the personal sphere that I was referring to earlier, about worldviews and values. And of course, this could be detected empirically by the sciences, different types of social science and so on, but it could also be investigated analytically, critically by philosophy to try to define perceptions that are perhaps adapting perceptions to what climate migration means, what climate change means for migrants or for society as such. And this sort of brings us to the next part, which is perhaps the most philosophical part, is that what kind of society is it? What historical moment are we in? That is sort of the basic philosophical questions of how we understand truth, the narratives that we live by, the imaginaries, as Janna was talking about earlier. Also, ethics, key issues here. And of course, what is a human in the Anthropocene? That is a very open question at the moment. And depending, of course, how much climate change will impact, it will need change in categories, as we've been talking about earlier this week as well. And that's a philosophical task as well. I think there's plenty to work on for philosophers, especially because the social sciences and humanities, which is sort of where philosophy has its strongest, well, it doesn't, maybe not true, but at least philosophy that I'm doing is continental kind, because so the analytical philosophy would support the natural sciences in a higher degree, bioscience and so on. But on a societal perspective, humanities and social sciences are adapting to climate change right now. There's more and more areas moving into that, and there will be a lot of change, conceptual adaptation as well, to keep in that terminology. So that's it.
Thank you, Søren.
Thank you.
And Kira?
Thank you. Yes, on the migration system, I mean, I guess it depends on what scale you're looking at. If you look at a little bit smaller scale, of course, it is meant to be the sending community and the receiving community and the migrant itself, right? So this is the basic kind of system a person is migrating in. So there's the community that sends people. So maybe there's people who are staying behind, maybe voluntarily, maybe involuntarily, because they are not able to move. And then there is the community that a migrant moves into, right? So this includes cities especially, but it can also be migration from kind of subsistence farming to more industrial farming communities. And of course, it also depends on how able a person is to integrate themselves into this receiving community. So, and how willing the receiving community and how able they are to welcome and host migrants there as well. So it's of course just a conceptual framework, and you can also frame it otherwise, but it makes sense to take into account when doing adaptation planning, these different communities and how they are affected by climate change impacts. So for example, maybe to make it a bit more plastic, when climate change affects a sending community, maybe through migration and remittances that are sent back to this community, people are able to fortify their houses, to open up new sources of income, to invest in such. And also receiving communities generally benefit from migration. So this is something has been proven over and over, that migrants do contribute significantly to economic growth. But there's also cases where migrants are migrating to very poor urban areas, as I mentioned, the case of Bangladesh, where you have very, very high unemployment rates, and where the only labor options available to them, because they don't have a network maybe there, because maybe they don't have particular skills that are needed in the urban context, then they migrate into a situation where they can only do very strong physical labor, so very tedious labor, sometimes also have to work in informal conditions, so conditions where labor security, workers' protection, working hours are not regulated, and sometimes women are also pushed into sexual labor. So there's also a lot of distress migration occurring in the context of climate change. And of course, also climate impacts occur also in the receiving communities. So it's not like people are completely then protected from climate change, as climate change affects now basically every country, right, in every location. So impacts that have occurred in the rural areas may not be the same in the urban areas, but maybe new impacts are relevant there. So if you think of the context of urban informal settlements, you have extreme heat conditions and very dense settlements in areas where you have corrugated roofs and the heat is really trapped in there. You have urban air pollution. You may have other health impacts, communicable diseases that are also affected by climatic factors. So all these types of new threats that people have to then be able to deal with, basically. So when looking at adaptation planning, it is important to, as François said, not only view migration as a type of threat that needs to be avoided, but also to enable people to move if they need to, enable those who want to stay if it's possible, if it's technologically possible, and also to provide them with skill trainings and other options so that they can quickly step into these new settings and basically live successful and self-determined lives there, because we have to acknowledge that the fossil fuel consumption that especially the global upper and middle classes are driving are limiting the option space of these people. Because the people I have interviewed are frequently emphasizing that they don't have any other option than to migrate. They stay as long as they possibly can, but if they cannot feed their families anymore, they're often forced to migrate. So their option space is very, very limited. They often don't have the type of passport that enables you to live and work and apply for visas in many countries. So it's really a question of agency in the end.
Thank you so much for all these answers. Thank you also for your patience, for staying a little bit longer than planned. I would also like to thank you not only for having given us a little insight of your work that you're realizing, today's speakers of our Roundtable 5, but also for the work in general that you are realizing. Tengo un poco este gran honor de estar dando el cierre a esta semana, bueno, con estas charlas, a la última charla de la Environmental Migration Week del CER y del GDIME. Y me gustaría agradecer no solamente a nuestros expositores del día de hoy y sus exposiciones, sino también al equipo organizador que ya se mencionó también al principio, que muchas gracias por crear este espacio y por invitar a algunos de nosotros a formar también parte de eso. También gracias a todas las personas que expusieron en otras mesas redondas, creo que hemos aprendido mucho. Por lo menos yo puedo decir eso. Y también muchas gracias a todas las personas que nos escucharon o aquí en vivo en el Zoom o por las redes sociales, que estamos también en vivo en YouTube y también en Facebook. Así que muchísimas gracias y hasta pronto, ojalá.
Gracias.
Un abrazo, gracias.
Gracias a todas y todos.
Adiós.